Hello and welcome. Today we're rethinking the contrived architecture of power. Picture a building, not any building. Think of the one that presides over and controls every single aspect of your life, and it does it without your consent. It has columns or cameras or just a plaque with an insignia that signals this is where all decisions are made. Now imagine something simple, almost silly. Imagine that the building only stands because we agree to stare at it without question. This exposes the overarching illusion of authority. So let's examine the stories we tell ourselves to keep power in place, while the widening cracks appearing in those stories and what we'll see if we finally looked away. For centuries, we've been told that government is an immovable fact of life, a permanent structure above us, designed to enforce order. But governance, as we know it, is less a necessity than an inculcated habit. In truth, it's a fragile construct of belief, coercion, and fear, without which it immediately disintegrates. Emerging voices in political philosophy argue that true governance isn't authority imposed from above. It's temporary stewardship, service grounded in life, conscience, and trust. Radical? Sure. Naive, some say. But where does that reflective cynicism come from? And who stands to lose if society recognises that authority itself is a meticulously crafted illusion? Let's start with cynicism, the shrug, the smirk, the safety of that'll never work. Political cynicism isn't just scepticism about bad ideas or broken policies. It's a kind of psychic defence. If you've ever laughed off a hopeful idea before it can touch you, then of course you know the move. Analysts suggest that society's refusal to imagine life beyond coercive structures conceals a deeper anxiety, a fear of what would have to be relinquished if we acknowledged a difficult truth. And that unavoidable truth is jarringly uncomfortable. Conscience cannot be outsourced. Truth is not relative. No human being holds innate authority over another. If you accept those premises, the scaffolding around modern power begins to tremble. Taxation as compulsion, compliance under threat, medical tyranny, and highly invasive surveillance as the cost of safety. The tacit permission we give to violence if it wears a uniform. The tremor isn't theoretical, it's visceral. Because if these structures don't derive their legitimacy from something higher than us, then they depend on us, our consent, our fear, our apathy, even cowardice. There's a reason cynicism feels protective. It spares us the grief of asking, where have I obeyed against my conscience? It delays the reckoning. It also delays the possibility that something different could be built. When you pull the camera back, authority looks less like a timeless necessity and more like a carefully maintained illusion. In one era, monarchs claim God's endorsement as a divine right. In another, bureaucracies invoke legal necessity. The costumes change, robes to suits, crowns to logos, but the story holds fast. Rule is justified and domination ensures peace. So how is that story kept stable? You use rituals and symbols, flags, anthems, oaths, uniforms, and the choreography of ceremony. You cultivate fear and promise, predictability. You repeat the lesson that compliance is maturity and disobedience is chaos. People routinely follow instructions such as standing in a designated space, accepting toxic jabs against better judgment, signing documents and accepting terms written by others without giving them due consideration. But what happens when relationships are founded not on coercion, but on alignment with conscience? The impulse to dominate loosens its grip. Social coherence, it turns out, doesn't have to arise from submission. It can emerge from mutual recognition of truth. You can see glimpses of this in places that never make headlines. A neighbourhood that coordinates food and care during a crisis or blackout without orders. A workplace that experiments with consent-based decision-making and discovers that responsibility grows when ownership is shared. A restorative circle that resolves harm without courts because everyone understands the stakes and agrees on the principles. None of this requires a parade. It requires trust and the willingness to see one another as ends and not means. If authority is, at bottom, a story we keep telling, who profits from the plot? The answer isn't subtle. The institutions are entirely dependent upon unquestioning obedience. Governments and their enforcers depend on taxation and legal compulsion to function. The industries of control, from surveillance tech to commercial incarceration to military contracting, they all sit atop economies of fear. There are also the psychological structures we carry within us. Generations trained to mistake obedience for moral responsibility, to find safety in submission because chaos has been framed as the only alternative. And then there's the corporate state handshake, where regulation, subsidy, and manufactured dependency keep populations tethered to centralised systems and keep risk privatised only when things go well. These institutions know their survival hinges on silencing discussions of natural self-governing order. Cynicism is strategically reinforced. It keeps the population mocking alternatives before they can seriously consider them. When satire and fatalism become the default mode, it's not only organic, it's curated. If you ridicule the idea of stewardship or consent-based governance long enough, it never gets to prove itself. You don't have to outlaw an idea if you can make it embarrassing. People hear self-governance and imagine collapse because they've been trained to equate order with force. The irony is that most sustainable order we see is the kind built by people who feel internally obligated to one another, not externally threatened. It's not just the police or the politician who has something at stake in maintaining the illusion. It's any enterprise that monetizes fear, any bureaucracy that staff its legitimacy with your fear of what would happen without it, any part of us that dreads the responsibility of freedom. There's a bite to the ridicule you hear when stewardship models of governance are mentioned. It doesn't sound like the careful critique of pragmatists. It sounds like protective mockery. To scoff at life beyond domination is to shield yourself from the existential pain of recognizing complicity in an arrangement that violates conscience. So let's just sit with that pain for a moment. Think of a time you did something because that's the rule, and yet you knew it wasn't right. Maybe it was minor, a fee that punished the poor, a policy that shamed the vulnerable. Maybe it was bigger. The point is not to drown in regret. It's to notice what cynicism kept you from trying. Cynicism masquerades as wisdom because it never risks anything. But what if we called it what it often is? Resistance. Not to bad ideas, but to uncomfortable truths. Natural law can sound grandiose or antiquated, so let's define it carefully. Not statutes chiselled in stone, but principles of justice embedded in conscience and reality itself. In this view, legitimacy isn't conferred by institutions, it's measured by our alignment, individually and collectively, with truth. Unlike man-made statutes, natural law doesn't require enforcement in the usual sense. It operates in a way honesty fosters trust, and trust reduces the need for locks. In the way respect fosters peace, and peace softens the impulse to control. That doesn't mean a world without conflict. It means a world where conflict is addressed by restoring right relationship rather than asserting superior force. Well, if that sounds abstract, consider what it would ask us in practice. First, consent becomes central. No taxes, fees, or penalties without genuine, ongoing consent. Second, responsibility shifts from a distant authority to local stewardship. Your block, your team, your town, people closest to the consequences making the decisions. And the decisions can be revoked if they violate conscience. Third, accountability changes shape. Harm is addressed by making people whole, by repair and reintegration, not simply by exile or cages. There are prototypes for this. Cooperatives governed by members, community land trusts that decouple shelter from speculation, restorative justice circles in schools that favour healing over punishment. None of them are perfect, but they point to something old and new at once. Order made by people who feel answerable to one another, not to an edifice. If these ideas continue to move from the fringes into serious discourse, our questions won't remain philosophical. They'll get painfully practical. Is obedience a virtue when the order itself is misaligned with conscience? Can taxation be legitimate without consent? Or is consent the very thing that makes it taxation rather than a tribute? Do systems of surveillance and punishment serve life, or do they feed an entrenched order and deceitfully call it peace? The truly naive belief isn't that people can govern themselves. It's believing that domination will ever deliver justice. For now, the architectural authority remains intact, held up not just by force, but by a collective agreement that it's necessary. Yet there are hairline fractures visible if you know where to look. People are opting out of pieces of the script, quietly and without permission. They're forming circles of collective trust in the shadow of big buildings. They're refusing to outsource conscience or consent to the immoral dictates of transnational cartels masquerading as government. And so, as the looming question changes shape, it gathers momentum. It's not whether the fabricated illusion can endure. Illusions can sustain for very long periods of time. It's how long society can ignore the exponentially burgeoning truth now resonating throughout all of humanity. That legitimacy and authentic governance does not come from unaccountable power, but from conscience, our conscience. Thank you for watching.